Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do an emulation showcase video of the ASUS ROG Ally X. Now I've been testing this for about a month and I've actually finished my final in-depth review, but I have a bunch of footage when it comes to emulation and a lot of things to talk about, so that's what we're going to cover here today. Now the processor within the ROG Ally X is the same Z1 Extreme that we've seen over the past year or so. So the performance here between the original Ally and the Legion Go and other handhelds using similar chipsets are going to be about the same in that they can basically emulate everything. We've got some pretty beefy CPU power here. However, the big game changer here is the battery life on this. Because we have an 80 watt-hour battery, it just allows us to play a lot more games for a lot longer of a time. And so throughout this showcase video, I'm going to have the amount of battery life that you can expect on the ROG Ally X down below. In addition, because the Ally X runs Windows out of the box, we are going to focus on Windows-based emulation, but we are also going to dive into some Linux-based distributions as well to show off the difference between the two when it comes to emulation in particular. Either way, if you're curious about what systems will actually work on a handheld PC nowadays and what kind of performance you can expect, this is going to be the video for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, as we jump into this, like I mentioned, we're going to focus on emulation on Windows for the most part, and I will tell you when we go into Linux. When it comes to setting up these emulators, I did a combination of using EmuDeck, which is a great tool that will pre-install a bunch of configurations and emulators for you, but then also just to streamline the process for this testing, I also manually installed a bunch and then launched everything from Emulation Station, which you can see here. And truth be told, setting up emulation on Windows can be a little bit intimidating just because there's so many little things that you have to do. But if you want to get your toes wet and start to emulate on Windows, I would recommend my EmuDeck for Windows guide. And I'll have a link to this and all the other things that I mentioned in this video down below. So we're going to jump in with the very easy stuff. So this is going to be your 8-bit and 16-bit emulation, all the things that you would usually run through RetroArch. And the nice thing about RetroArch is that it stays at a steady 8 watt total package power when playing these retro games. What that means is that the battery is going to drain 8 watts per hour when you're playing these games, and because we have an 80 watt hour battery on the ROG Ally X, that means we can expect an average of 10 hours of gameplay when playing these various retro systems. A couple other things to keep in mind: this is a 16:9 aspect ratio screen, which means when playing 4:3 content, things like Super Nintendo and Genesis, you are going to get black bars on the left and right. And when factoring in the rather large bezels on the ROG Ally X, that is something to keep in mind if you don't like to see bezels like this. For my part, I don't really mind it. It's a 7-inch screen, and so even if it's showing 4:3 content, it still looks really nice and impressive. In addition, I like the color balance and saturation of the screen. I think it makes all these games really pop. And because we have a 1080p resolution, I don't really feel the need to do any integer scaling. We have so many pixels to work with that I don't mind that a few of them are out of balance. So I think when it comes down to it, I wouldn't primarily play retro game emulation on an $800 device like this, but you can definitely knock out some classic games if you would like. Now, one thing to consider are vertically oriented games. These are games that have really big bezels on each side when you play them at a landscape orientation like this. However, there is a setting within the RetroArch arcade cores that will allow you to rotate the screen into what they call Tate mode. From there, you can reconfigure the controls so that your right analog stick is going to act as your joystick, and then you can still use your face buttons as well. And when you lay it down flat on a table, it kind of turns into this little arcade machine, and I've really been enjoying this setup. Now, admittedly, it is a little bit weird when you first get started, but after you start thinking of it like a tiny little arcade machine, it's actually a lot of fun. Now, one of the main benefits of the ROG Ally and now the Ally X is that they have a 120Hz screen. And I think that's a big deal when it comes to playing retro games, because then you can use a feature called black frame insertion. And as the name implies, when you're using a 120Hz screen, that means you can make every other frame just a black image. To give you an idea of what this means, I'm going to turn on black frame insertion on the left side and then turn it off on the right. The first thing you're going to notice is that the screen on the left is darker, and that's because every other frame is black, which means that everything else is going to be a little bit less bright. The second thing you're going to notice as we're playing in slow motion is that the main character sprite is not going to have any motion blur. If you look at Link, every time he's at the top or the bottom of a jump, there's a bunch of blurring that's happening just with one specific frame. Meanwhile, on the left side, you will see that everything is nice and sharp the entire time, no matter what. And what this means is when we're playing the game in full speed, everything's going to look just a lot more crisp and clear. It's very hard to describe without seeing it yourself, but I would say it makes these sprites a little bit more present looking. And it's a very similar effect when you're playing these games on a CRT television. And that's the main benefit right there. You can take an LCD screen and make it feel more like a CRT TV, and that's going to be amazing when playing these retro-styled games. Now, setting this up is pretty easy. You just want to make sure that you're running at 120 Hz with your display, and then go into the RetroArch settings, then video settings and synchronization. Within this menu, you will see an option to turn on black frame insertion. You've got a bunch of different options depending on the refresh rate of your screen, but we're going to set it to just 1. You can also do this at home if you have a high refresh rate screen that goes into an even number. Now, one interesting note is that when I manually installed RetroArch and turned on black frame insertion, it actually wouldn't get to a 120 Hz frame rate. Instead, it never really hit that point, and so it caused a lot of flickering, and I wasn't really sure what was going on here. I tried all sorts of power profiles and different configurations, and I couldn't get it to work. And I found this especially weird because I had no problems running this on my ROG Ally with the same screen and processor. But after thinking about it for a while, I realized the first time around I had installed RetroArch via EmuDeck as opposed to manually. And so just to be safe, I went and I uninstalled RetroArch and then reinstalled it via EmuDeck. And somehow that's what actually fixed things, so I'm not really sure what's going on here, but either way, if you have any sort of flickering issues while trying to use black frame insertion with RetroArch, I would recommend installing it via EmuDeck because that seems to fix things. Regardless, if you have a device with a 120 Hz screen, either the old Ally or the new one, or maybe a different device, I would recommend trying this out because it is pretty awesome. Now, the last thing I would recommend checking out in addition to black frame insertion are also CRT shaders. And that's because the combination of the two can make a really interesting effect on your screen. And because the Z1 Extreme processor is so powerful, we can throw all these layers on top, including really high-res shaders, as well as black frame insertion, and it's still not going to hurt the battery too bad. So within the shaders menu, I would recommend going into the CRT section and checking out some of these options. A combination I would recommend is going to be black frame insertion plus the CRT Hylian RGB Trinitron shader. This will give you a light CRT effect that just looks really good in combination with BFI. And even with these features stacked upon each other, we're still going to get close to 9 hours of battery life when playing retro games. Now, another group of shaders that I really like are the CRT Royale pack, and these ones are a little bit more intensive, so it is going to drop your battery down to about 7.5 hours, but I think they look really good, and that's still plenty of time to play those retro games. One thing to bear in mind, when you do stack on a shader on top of BFI, it will make the screen even darker. So I would really only recommend doing this in a dimly lit scenario, like for example playing indoors or at night, something like that. I wouldn't want to play this outdoors. So when it comes down to it, when we're talking about retro gaming, I don't think that the ROG Ally X is really intended to play retro games. After all, it is a PC for the most part. But I think that if you really want to get the most out of it when it comes to retro gaming, you've got a lot of options to work with, and I always love being in that kind of situation. So let's start moving up and talk about some of the more intensive systems. We'll start with Nintendo 64. There's a couple interesting things here. Number one, because the analog sticks are so good on the Ally X, it really shines on an analog system like Nintendo 64 and Mario 64 in particular. Also, the power demands on systems from this kind of era, things like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, are also not very intense. You can get close to 8 hours of battery life. Now, another thing worth mentioning, because we're talking about a Windows PC, that means we can also play PC ports of a lot of retro games. So for example, playing the PC port of Super Mario 64, we can now blow this up to a 16:9 aspect ratio and 60 frames per second, and we actually get improved battery life over emulation, so we can play this for over 9 hours. And there are a ton of different games that will run on Windows specifically that can play a lot of old retro games or something very close to it. A great example would be Pokemon Infinite Fusion. This one is specifically made with Windows in mind. But as you can see, it actually is modeled after the Game Boy Advance era of Pokemon games. And because it's such a lightweight Windows game, you can get over 13.5 hours of gameplay with this one. One more example worth noting before we move back into emulation is that there are PC ports of both Jak and Daxter as well as Jak 2. And these will run at the native aspect ratio and resolution of your display, and then also will be at 60 frames per second. And again, they're not going to be very power hungry. You can get a good 6.5 hours of gameplay with these. Anyway, back to emulation. When it comes to these systems, all the way up through things like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and Sega Saturn, you can expect to be able to play these on the lowest power profile, even if you throw on things like shaders and use really intensive cores. And that's probably one of the main benefits of having a Windows-based handheld PC like this, is because there are decades of emulation development work that have happened on this platform. And with a handheld PC like this, we can take advantage of all that previous work. Moving along, let's talk about a couple handheld systems. We'll start with PSP. Now this one I like to play at a 4x upscale, which will give us a 1080p resolution. And even when we're bumping it up to a higher upscale, it's still not going to tap into the higher resources required on the Z1 Extreme. So we can play these games in silent mode, and many of them will play for a good 8 or 9 hours depending on the game. Now the really intense PSP games like God of War Chains of Olympus, these will require a little bit more juice, but even then you will get a good 5.5 hours of gameplay. Along those same lines, if you wanted to play Nintendo 3DS, this one also isn't that power intensive. I'm going to use the most recent version of Citra before it was taken down. And here I'm playing at a 4x upscale, and I'm still getting about 8 hours of battery life because it requires 10 watts altogether. So all things considered, if you are looking to play things like PSP or Nintendo 3DS, this is going to be a great solution here. So now let's move into Generation 6, which is going to be like PS2 era and beyond. I think for the most part, when people are thinking about emulation with a handheld PC, this is the kind of gaming that they're talking about. So let's really focus on this. We'll start with Nintendo GameCube, and these can play at a 3x resolution, which will be actually higher than 1080p, but still scale very well for the system. And I would say the majority of games can still play in silent mode, and so you will be able to knock out maybe 6 or 7 hours of gameplay because it's not going to be that intensive. Now, one interesting thing about Dolphin and GameCube in particular is that the high-end games, things like F-Zero as well as Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, these ones are going to require a lot more power. So these I did bump up in the ASUS settings to the higher performance mode, which they just call performance mode, and then I also turned on CPU boost to make sure that I was getting a very stable frame rate. And that combination is going to require more battery. We're still talking about somewhere between 3.5 and 4 hours of battery life, which I think is still plenty when it comes to playing retro games, but it is quite a bit worse than it was with the other ones. Either way, yes, you're going to be able to play every GameCube game that's compatible with the emulator up to 1080p resolution and still get 3.5 or more hours of gameplay. It's a similar story with Nintendo Wii. I found that many of these did not require CPU boost, but for the most part they were more power hungry. So in this case, I would find that most games would last between 5 and 6 hours altogether. And it's pretty similar when it comes to PlayStation 2, although there were a couple other considerations I had to keep in mind. The first is that most games would play in silent mode, but I did have to play it by ear when it came to the graphical backend. Some games would play just fine in Vulkan, others required OpenGL, but the vast majority actually did the best with DirectX 12. And so that's what I ended up putting as my default, was that graphical backend, and then I would go and make per game changes depending on how it would play. And again here I'm using a 3x resolution, which is going to give us higher than 1080p, and it's going to look amazing on the screen. Now when it came to the high-end spectrum of emulated games, things like God of War 2 or Champions of Norrath, then I would usually have to boost it into performance mode. But surprisingly, I never found myself having to turn on CPU boost like I did with Dolphin. Instead, I found that just that one little settings tweak would usually make all the games run fine, even at that full 3x resolution. And the worst case battery that I found was with Champions of Norrath, and I got a little bit under 3 hours of battery life. Again, that's about as much as I can handle when it comes to one gaming session, so I think it's pretty good. So I think at this point we've seen a bunch of emulation systems that do really well. I don't think we've seen any real drawbacks here other than maybe some battery life things, or maybe that the screen doesn't get quite as bright when you throw on a bunch of shaders. But other than that, I think everything's been good. So let's move into things that are a little bit more challenging just overall. So let's start with the original Xbox. Again, this is a Generation 6 system like PS2 and GameCube, but this one's a lot harder to emulate. And a lot of this just comes down to development time, and there hasn't been a lot of work on this compared to the others. And right off the bat, I found that I had to push a lot of power into this emulator just to get some games to work at full speed. And there were some games that played great, like Soul Calibur 2, and even Blinx the Time Sweeper was very close, not quite at full speed, but I would say this was mostly playable. Just bear in mind that the battery life on this is going to pale in comparison to the other ones that we've been talking about before. I would expect in general just about 2 hours of gameplay no matter what Xbox game you try to play. And also bear in mind that the vast majority of the games that I tried did not play at full speed, or at least what I would consider to be playable. For some games, as a last resort, I would plug them into a charger just to give it a full 30-watt turbo boost, but even then, games like Project Gotham Racing did not play at full speed and were nowhere close to it. And this is the first, and I would say only system throughout the rest of our testing where I don't recommend buying the Ally X or really any other handheld PC to emulate this system. It's just that hard on Windows. Now there is a bright side to this, and we'll revisit that later on when we get to the Linux side when we start testing it that way. Either way, let's move on to the next generation and start talking talking about Nintendo Wii U. Now thankfully development on the CEMU emulator has really matured over the years, and so almost every single game is going to play just fine, and a lot of them are not going to require a lot of power. And there are some games that I'm still waiting to come out on Switch from the Wii U, and that includes Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess HD. And another great thing about these two games in particular is that they run at a native 1080p resolution, so they are going to look perfectly scaled on the ROG Ally X screen. Now things can get a lot more challenging. For example, with Breath of the Wild, this is my favorite way to play this game on Wii U as opposed to Switch. And most of that has to do with the configuration I can do on the emulation side, so I can adjust things like the resolution and frame rate, and even turn on cheats and mods. And so in general, you'll probably be able to play this game at around 45 frames per second, which is well above the standard 30 frames, so it's going to feel really nice and smooth, but it is going to come at a performance cost, and I would expect to only be able to play this game for about 2.5 hours per sitting. Either way, I think the juice is worth the squeeze to be able to play this at 1080p in handheld mode and have all those optimizations. Now the next system I want to talk about is PlayStation 3, and this is probably one of the main highlights when it comes to emulation for me. And that's because all the factors just seem to converge right here with PS3 and even Xbox 360 emulation. That's because this chipset can handle just about anything you can throw at it when it comes to these systems, but then also they natively play at 16:9, and then also usually between 720p or 1080p, so they're going to look great on the screen. When it comes to lightweight PS3 games, you're going to be able to get a lot of gameplay here, usually over 5 hours of gameplay, and then usually between 3 and 4 with the ones that are going to be a little bit more intensive. Either way, I would say that as long as the game's compatible with the emulator, you should get somewhere between like 3 and 6 hours of gameplay with about half the catalog altogether. And I would say up to this level is exactly where the Steam Deck will cap out. It will be able to play games like Demon's Souls, but this is about the max that it's going to be able to handle. So on one hand, it's really cool that the Steam Deck is able to play about half of the PS3 games in the catalog, as long as you're okay with playing the lightweight games. However, this is where that Van Gogh processor within the Steam Deck really starts to hit a limitation wall, because it doesn't have that many CPU cores compared to something like the Z1 Extreme on the ROG Ally. And this is where things get really interesting, because now we're starting to get into the more intensive 3D games, some of those that you really just wouldn't expect to be able to play on a handheld PC without a discrete graphics card. Let's start with Infamous as our example. This is a game that runs at 30 frames per second natively, but you can get higher than that if the processor allows it. And sure enough, with the Ally X in turbo mode, we can get it up to about 45 or 50 frames per second on average, and that's going to feel super smooth and zippy. And so barring any sort of emulation compatibility concerns, I would say this is a game that is fully playable on the Ally X, and you're going to be able to get over 2 hours of gameplay time. Now, if we try to play the exact same game in settings on the Steam Deck, you will find that it is nowhere close to being playable for me. The average frame rate is going to be somewhere between 50 and 20 frames per second. It's going to be super slow and choppy, so I would not recommend trying to play Infamous on the Steam Deck. And so that's really where the Ally X starts to shine for me, in that it can play systems that you can't play on something like the Steam Deck, and it can play it in a way that's supremely enjoyable because of the native aspect ratio here. But then also in general, you can expect about 2 hours of gameplay time even when pushing it pretty far in turbo mode. And so all of a sudden, games like God of War 3 I would consider to be playable, to the point where I'm actually looking forward to playing through this game on the Ally X if I ever get some time to actually play games instead of making videos about them. And it's the exact same situation with Metal Gear Solid 4. This is the first handheld I've ever actually spent the time to install and configure, because it actually has the juice, both in terms of battery and processor, to play this game in a way that it actually deserves it. I know the ongoing joke about Metal Gear Solid 4 is the best way to emulate it is just to watch it on YouTube, since it's like 90% cutscenes, but I still really do want to play through this game one more time, and I think the Ally X is the closest we've ever come to a perfect scenario. And it is a very similar experience with Xbox 360, both on its own and also in comparison with the Steam Deck OLED. The major concern here is going to be compatibility. As long as the game will work with this emulator, it should in general work just fine with the Ally, and then maybe also about 50% of the catalog will be pretty playable on the Steam Deck too. This is mostly going to be your more lightweight games. I would say everything pushing it up to certain RPGs is going to be okay. Blue Dragon is a great example. This is both an RPG and also a little bit lightweight, so it plays just fine on the ROG Ally X, and I also find it to be playable on the Steam Deck OLED too. However, everything past that usually gets pretty tricky for the Steam Deck. Let's look at Project Gotham Racing 4. This is a game that should run at 30 frames per second, but it struggles. I would say the average is about 25 frames per second on the Steam Deck, and you're gonna feel every single one of those dips, and it's just not a very enjoyable experience considering this is a driving game. Meanwhile, on the ROG Ally X, I don't even have to push it to turbo mode. I can just play it in performance mode and it plays just fine. It's also gonna give me 3 hours and 47 minutes of battery life compared to 2.5 hours on the Steam Deck. So not only is the game going to be fully playable compared to the Steam Deck OLED, but it also is going to allow me to play it for longer. And so I would say as long as compatibility works with the emulator, you should be able to enjoy a good amount of Xbox 360 games on the ROG Ally X, especially compared to other handhelds on the market. And if you really have to push things, say for example with Forza Horizon, this one you will have to push into turbo mode and you're going to get a little bit less than 2 hours of gameplay. But just bear in mind, I did find a ceiling when it came to Xbox 360 emulation on the ROG Ally X, both in terms of compatibility, just because not every game is going to play on it, but then also just in terms of performance. Let's use Crackdown as our example. Even when pushing it into turbo mode, I was not getting a consistent 30 frames per second. Instead, it would dip down to something like 26 here and there. And yes, I could definitely feel those dips, and so I found this to be less than ideal. And the simple answer here is that it just requires more wattage to play some of these games on this Xenia emulator. So a good solution at this point, if you really want to play this game on the Ally X, would be to plug it in. That's going to give you a 30 watt TDP turbo boost. And this will give you a more consistent 30 frames per second performance on Crackdown. And so I would say it's fully playable once you plug it in. And there will be quite a few games that are like this, including 2 Human. So I think when it comes down to it, with Xbox 360 emulation, this is one where I'm a little bit hesitant to say that you should definitely buy this machine to emulate this system, just because compatibility is still pretty poor. Again, this is an emulator that hasn't had a lot of development for it just yet. And then you will also be facing some performance constraints, and I don't think that that's a good place to be in terms of buying a handheld specifically to emulate one platform. So if anything, I would say Xbox 360 is a bonus system in that many games are going to play fine, but I wouldn't rely on every single game being playable. Okay, and finally, the last system I wanted to touch on just very briefly from a technical demo standpoint is going to be Nintendo Switch emulation. I'm going to use the latest version of Sudachi, which is a fork of Yuzu, before this one was also taken down. And I would say you can probably split this into 2 different camps. You have those that are pretty easy to run and then those that are harder to run. And I would say across either of these, you'll be able to play all these games in docked mode. That means that most of these games will run at a 1080p resolution and they're going to look amazing on the screen. Now, when it comes to the games that are just going to run a little bit more easily, I would say you can play these games in performance mode, again in docked mode as well, and you can expect somewhere between like 4.5 and 5 hours of gameplay. And I would say this is going to be for the vast majority of the Nintendo Switch games in their catalog. They're going to be playable as long as the compatibility is still going to be okay. Now, as we look at the other half of Switch games, those that are a little bit more intense, that require a little bit more power, these ones you will probably have to turn on turbo mode. And these games will still play at full speed, but it will tax the battery quite a bit more. So for these, I would expect somewhere around 2 hours of gameplay altogether. The only game that I really had a lot of struggles with is this one, which we're not going to talk about. I will say that I went through and used the latest mod presets that you can find on GitHub, and even then, using these Steam Deck settings, it was still not quite getting 30 frames per second. This one is hard to judge just because it takes a long time for the shaders to compile. We're talking about hours of gameplay. And so even though I did play through this one on the Steam Deck, I found the performance to be pretty much the same between the Steam Deck and this system. Okay, so that's a wrap when it comes to Windows-based emulation. Let's move on and start talking about Linux-based emulation. I'm going to use 2 different examples here. The first one I want to talk about is Batocera. This is an emulation platform that's been around for years, one of my favorite to use altogether. And one of my favorite things about Batocera is that it can be installed on many different platforms. You can put it on a micro SD card, you can put it on an internal drive, you can put it on an external drive, and then boot them all from there. And ideally, I'd love to put Batocera on a micro SD card. That way I can plug it into the ROG Ally, boot into that card, and then play it like that, then take it out when I don't want to play it. But unfortunately, much like with the original ROG Ally, the Ally X is not able to boot from an SD card. If you go into the BIOS, it won't even show it as an available boot option. Now, thankfully, the ROG Ally does allow you to boot from an external drive. And so here I have just a SanDisk 2 terabyte drive loaded up with Batocera. I use this with a lot of my testing. And so I am able to plug this into my ROG Ally X, go into the BIOS, and then boot this instead. And so when it came to booting into Batocera, that's what I ended up doing. Now, to be honest, the only thing I was really concerned about testing with this is the one system that I didn't find to be playable on Windows, and that's the original Xbox. And that's because with Batocera and other Linux kernels, I've found that it always usually will play a lot better than on Windows. Anyway, to give you an example, yes, as expected, I found that Linux performance was a lot better than on Windows. So with Blinx the Time Sweeper, a game that was not quite playing at full speed at a native resolution, I can now play at full speed at a 2x resolution instead. And so if you do happen to have an ROG Ally or an Ally X and you are dead set on playing Xbox emulation, I would say figure out a way to play it on Linux instead, either through Batocera or the next one we're going to talk about here in a moment. But just bear in mind, it's not a miracle worker. For example, with Project Gotham Racing, this one was faster, but not quite at full speed. So long story short, yes, Batocera will work on the ROG Ally and Ally X, but you will have to boot it from an external drive as opposed to an SD card. But other than that, yes, it's going to work, and it will greatly improve your Xbox emulation in particular. Now, the next Linux-based system that I wanted to talk about is one that I've been experimenting with over the past day or so, and so I'm not quite ready to make a full video about it yet, but I did want to give just a couple highlights, and this one is called Bazzite. And essentially, this is a Linux platform that behaves like SteamOS, but without having to use a Steam Deck. So you'll be able to use the entire SteamOS interface that you know and love. You can even boot into the desktop environment. All that's going to work here within Bazzite. The great thing here is that you can also dual boot it. So I have a 4TB drive that I've installed on this ROG Ally X, and then I've had 2TB partitioned for Windows, and then another 2TB partitioned for Bazzite. And in terms of the experience, it's the exact same. So I can bring up the whole Steam interface, I can bring up the quick access menu and everything. But there are a couple extra layers to it. For example, if I double click on the QAM button, it'll bring up the Bazzite menu here. And this one brings up a different app, and it's called Handheld Daemon, but this allows you to make a bunch of different configuration changes. You can adjust your TDP right here. You can even adjust the RGB lighting. You can even make the controller behave like a DualSense controller or an Xbox controller, whatever you would like. And so it's almost like having Steam Deck on the Ally X with a bunch of additional options too. Either way, when it comes to emulation, setting it up is just like setting up emulation on a Steam Deck. So I used EmuDeck, I installed everything using my own guide, and then after that I can now access all of my emulation platforms right here within SteamOS. And so I'm going to do a lot more testing with Bazzite before I make a full dedicated video about it, because I think there are some really neat reasons why you may actually want to consider it. So that will be for the next video. For now, we're just going to focus on some of the emulation performance that I found here as compared to Windows. So let's start with the original Xbox, because we were just talking about it with Batocera, and the experience here is very similar, if not a little bit better. So here with Blinx the Time Sweeper, again at a 2x resolution, I'm getting 2 hours and 42 minutes of gameplay. And I'm not quite sure what the battery life is on Batocera because I'm not able to bring up those menus within their system, but I do know that this is about 40 minutes better battery life than native resolution on Windows. So not only are we playing at double the resolution, but we're actually requiring less power and getting more battery life. And in general, I found that many games I expected to not be fully playable on Windows were completely playable just fine on Linux. Even something like the original Halo can be played at a 2x resolution and you can still get 2.5 hours of battery life. Now, to be honest, because this is a handheld PC, you could also just load up the Steam version of the Master Chief Collection and play Halo 1 that way. But me, I kind of like jumping into the OG Halo from time to time. It's one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time. Either way, even Halo 2 is a pretty great experience on here. I did get a couple slowdown dips here and there, and I did have to drop it down to a native resolution, but even then, I still got 2.5 hours of gameplay, and yeah, it was pretty fun. For the last example, I'm going to use Project Gotham Racing one more time, because this is a game that struggled to even be barely playable on Windows, and it was pretty close on Batocera, but here I found on Bazzite it is even closer. I'd say that I'm still seeing about a 10% slowdown, and so it's not quite at 100% full speed, but it is very close, and easily the best I've ever seen on a handheld PC, and one of the best I've seen on any PC that doesn't have dedicated graphics. And so I think this does go to show that yes, if you're looking for native Xbox emulation, I actually think that Bazzite might give you a better experience than Batocera. At the very least, it's certainly going to give you a better experience than trying to play it on Windows. Okay, and finally, just because I didn't want to spend all my time testing only Xbox, I also tested out Xbox 360. And so I would say performance here is about neck and neck between Linux and Windows, but I would say efficiency is better on Windows. For example, with Lost Odyssey, I got about 30 minutes less gameplay compared to what I was getting on Windows. So it's still going to be over 2 hours, and I think that's plenty of time to be able to emulate one of these high-end systems, but it's not going to be quite as good as Windows. Either way, it is kind of amazing that I'm playing a Windows app through an experimental Proton layer on a Linux-based operating system that is meant for the Steam Deck, but that has been ported over for systems like the ROG Ally X. And by using Bazzite, we're going to get some of those benefits of using a Linux kernel, like a really good working suspend mode like it is on the Steam Deck. Anyway, I think that's about it for this video. I wanted to just go through all my favorite emulated systems and show you how they play on the ROG Ally X. And to be honest, the performance that you're seeing here is about what you can expect on Ryzen 7000, 8000 series CPUs, as well as on last year's ROG Ally, as well as the Lenovo Legion Go. The big thing that's really separating the Ally X from these others is that 80 watt-hour battery. It allows us to play games that I would say are not really going to be worth it when it comes to handhelds with smaller batteries, but now all of a sudden I can play things like God of War 3 and Metal Gear Solid 4, things that I never expected to play on a handheld, and to me that is super exciting. Either way, I hope that you found this video helpful. It takes me several days to record all of this footage and put it all together and get all the context, and so I'm hoping that even though I love making these videos, it also has some insight for you too. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.